Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Phyrexia All Will Be One spoilers. So, over the last few days, spoilers have been trickling in, but today kicked off official spoiler season, and we have an epic flood of spoilers. Seriously, I think this might be the biggest spoiler video of all time, which probably means this is going to end up being the longest spoiler video of all time, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking ridiculous new planeswalkers, the return of poison, a new living weapon style mechanic, and just a ridiculous amount of awesome stuff. So before we do, a couple of reminders. Number one, if you need some Phyrexia cards, you can snag them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish. And number two, to keep up on spoilers throughout the day and throughout spoiler season, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk about the amazing new cards from Phyrexia All Will Be One. First up today, we got another completed planeswalker, and my god, is this card absurd. Nissa Ascended Animist. So Nissa, it's 7 mana for 7 loyalty, except 2 of its mana is green completed Phyrexian mana. So what this means in practice is you can play Nissa for 7 mana with 7 loyalty. You can play it for 6 mana in 2 life and get 5 loyalty, or you can play it for 5 mana in 4 life and get 3 loyalty. So a lot of flexibility here. It's going to be at its best at 7 mana, but there are going to be times when you play it for lower amounts. As far as its abilities, +1, create an XX green Phyrexian Horror creature token, where X is Nissa Ascendant Animist loyalty. So essentially, this is the most powerful +1 token making ability we have ever seen on a planeswalker, bar none. It is a ton of mana that is worth keeping in mind, but if you play this for full price, it comes down pluses up to 8 loyalty and you get an 8/8. Even if you play this for, let's say, 6 mana, it's going to be a 6 mana 6/6 token. A little bit weak at 5 mana. At 5 mana, you're going to get a 4/4 token, but that's going to keep growing if Nissa maintains her loyalty. -1, blow up an artifact or enchantment, and then the big payoff, -7 until end of turn. Creatures you control get +1/+1 for each forest you control and gain trample. So if you cast Nissa for full price, no completion, no Phyrexian mana, this comes down and immediately overruns. It's the planeswalker version of Craterhoof Behemoth. So as I mentioned before, the +1 is, I think, bar none, the most powerful token creation we have ever seen on a planeswalker. Compare this to other expensive planeswalker, like Elspeth Sun's Champion makes 3 1/1s, Garruk Apex Predator makes a 3/3 with Death Touch, Vivian Monsters Advocate makes a 3/3 with your choice of an ability. Nissa is coming down at 5 mana, it's making a 4/4 the first turn. At 6 mana, it's making a 6/6 the first turn. At 7 mana, it's making an 8/8 the first turn, and it's gaining loyalty. So every turn that token's gonna get bigger as you make more of them. It is absolutely ridiculous. The rest of the abilities, I think, are actually pretty good too. Naturalize, blowing up an artifact and enchantment, it might not sound exciting, but when you consider we're in a standard where some of the most played cards and most powerful cards in the format are Fable the Mirrorbreaker, Reckoner Bankbuster, Wedding Announcement, the ability is actually just incredibly powerful. This is sniping several of the most played cards and most powerful cards in the format. And then the ultimate, assuming you're a mono green deck or mostly green deck with a lot of forests, it's pretty Craterhoofy. Like, this is often going to be pay 7 mana, play it, immediately overrun, and just win the game on the spot. It's like a Blanchwood Arbor version of Craterhoof Behemoth. So this card seems absolutely ridiculous to me. And I gotta say, one of the most interesting parts of many of the planeswalkers from this set is I feel like Wizards finally solved the planeswalker being bad in Commander problem. In Commander, the big problem with planeswalkers is you got 3 opponents, so they often die the first turn cycle that they come into play. You play them, you use one ability, and then your opponents kill it, and that's all the value you get out of it. The way around this problem is making planeswalkers do something powerful right away, and we see a great example of this with Nissa. Nissa is going to be absurd in green decks in Commander because of that -7. You just play it for 7 mana, immediately -7. It's going to leave the battlefield, but that's fine. It's like, it's an overrun. It's a 7 mana planeswalker sorcery that is probably going to win you the game like Craterhoof Behemoth. So yes, it does cost a lot of mana, and that's worth keeping in mind. fine. But remember, this is a green card. Green is very good at ramping forests onto the battlefield, nature's lores and cultivates and explosive vegetations. So casting this with no Phyrexian mana, it is not going to be a big deal for green commander decks. And even in other formats, green is pretty good at ramping. Plus, you can play this in multicolor decks, I think, in part because of Yavimaya, which will just turn all lands into forests. Remember, it doesn't say basic forest or anything like that, so you can do the same trick as Cabal, Coffers, and Urborg, essentially, where you Yavimaya, so all your lands are forests, even if they're not really forests, and then the overrun is going to trigger off all your lands. Plus, it counts dual lands, stomping grounds, original dual lands, any land that has the type. So if we compare this to other expensive planeswalkers, I think this is one that actually has a chance. I know yesterday we were a little skeptical of Kaya being that good because it's 7 mana. It is true that you have a high bar to get over to be playable as a 7 mana planeswalker, but the fact that Nissa has that double complete cost, so it can be a 5 mana planeswalker or a 6 mana planeswalker, that really helps. The fact that it's -7 is probably game ending a lot of the time. The fact that it makes the biggest token we've ever seen out of planeswalkers makes me think that this card is going to be very, very good, even though it's an expensive planeswalker. As far as standard is concerned, I think it's got a shot. Like, you do need to be mostly green. We don't have Yavimaya in standard or anything, and I really think the most powerful ability on Nissa is that overrun effect. You want that overrun to be game winning. Thankfully, you don't need 7 forests on the battlefield for that to work. Overrun is what? +3/+3 in trample for 5 mana? So even if you have half of your lands as forests by the time you play Nissa, it's probably good enough. Plus, even in standard, yes, we don't have Cultivate or whatever, but we still have plenty of ways to ramp into this. Gala Greeters, Jewel Thief, additional land drop cards like Azusa's Many Journeys, which flip into a creature. Weather Seed Treaty gets a land and makes a token. Defiler of Vigor, really massive ramps into Nissa. So I think this card could bring mono green back in standard. It's been a while since we've had a mono green deck. Nissa is the reason to play mono green. Just like Craterhoof was a reason to play a green deck a decade ago, Nissa is the same thing. You just play green things, you just play forests, and you have this card that comes down and immediately ends the game with the overrun ultimate. I think this is also going to be very good in Pioneer and Explorer. Once you get past Pioneer and Explorer, back to like Modern or Legacy, Nissa loses a lot of its upside just because Craterhoof exists. So I'm picturing like Pioneer Elves, let's say, or Explorer Elves. I think Nissa is going to be an absurd finisher because those decks don't get access to actual Craterhoof, and you can ramp into it super easily. Elves are just so good at making mana. So you play all your Elves, you do your Elf stuff, then you Nissa, then you Ultimate, then you win the game on the spot. Like I said, in Modern or Legacy, Craterhoof's probably just better because you can tutor it up with Natural Order or Green Sun Zenith or any of the Court of Calling, whatever green creature tutors you have. The other place I think this card is bonkers is in Commander. And I already talked about this a little bit, how these planeswalkers from Phyrexia all will be one really seem designed to work in Commander. Wizards crack the code of making good Commander planeswalkers. I think this is worth including in essentially any mono green deck. Like, if you're mono green, the ability to blow up artifacts and enchantments is great. The ability to make tokens is great. And then the ultimate just ends the game. So any mono green deck is going to take advantage of this card, especially if you're a rampy one, Savala or Omnath or Vorinclex has a lot of synergies. But like I said before, because of Yavimaya and green's ability to find lands pretty easily, I think 2-color and even 3-color decks probably want this card, especially if you're a creature heavy decks that really want the overrun effect. Tovolar Werewolves, Kyler tokens, Lathril, Go Wide Elves, Jetmir tokens. Even though you're 3 colors, I think you just plan on finding your Yavimaya or trusting that enough of your lands are going to be forests that the overrun's going to work, and you still play Nissa. So Nissa and Animist, the card's ridiculous. It is ridiculous. I think this card can bring back mono green in standard. I think we'll see it show up in Pioneer and in Explorer, and I think this is one of the better planeswalkers we've ever seen for the Commander format. So all around, completed Nissa seems like an absolutely ridiculous busted card. We also got a non-completed planeswalker in Tyvar Jubilant Brawler. This one, not quite as exciting, but it has a static ability that offers some potential. So 3 mana Golgari, 3 loyalty, +1, untap up to 1 target creature, -2, mill 3 cards, then you can reanimate a creature mana value 2 or less, and then its static ability, you can activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures have haste. So Tyvar, I think this is essentially a combo piece. I think you're playing this for its static ability, which is essentially 1,000-Year Elixir, which is part of many different combos. So I think if you're playing a 1,000-Year Elixir style combo deck, that Tyvar just modes can be a backup. You essentially play this and 1000 Year Elixir, so you have a little more redundancy. The other modes, untapping a creature, I mean, that's fine. You can untap a Mana Dork, get Pseudo Vigilance. The reanimation mode, I guess it's okay. It's essentially one of the modes on a Inscription of Ruin. 2 mana value or less is a little restrictive, but still it offers some value. As far as standard, its best bet's probably like a Sultai or Golgari graveyard deck. I will say, every single time they print a new set, I get hyped for this graveyard deck and think it's going to be really sweet, and I build it and I play it, and it never ends up being as good as I want because there's a ton of graveyard hate in standard. But Tyvar does seem to fit in like an Old Stick Fingers, Urborg Lurglyph, Shigeki style deck. Like, it can reanimate most of the big pieces. Imagine getting back your Urborg Lurglyph or something. It's going to be massive. Even the static ability is kind of relevant. Like, you can activate your Shigeki right away, so it doesn't have to sit out and maybe die to removal. Also, if you want to go really deep, the ability works really well with Deathbloom Ritualist, a 5 mana dork, I guess. Is it even a mana dork at 5 mana? But it taps at an amount of mana equal to the number of creatures in your graveyard. So if you got Tyvar, it comes down with haste, probably taps for like 5 mana, 10 mana. Then you can even untap it and just make a ridiculous amount of mana. So maybe there's some sort of weird combo that casts a huge Old Stick Fingers or channel Shigeki for a ton with that mana. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm going to build the deck. My heart has been broken by this archetype so many times recently. My hopes are not really high that it's going to be like tier 1 or anything, but it does seem fun. Like I said before, I think where this really shines is in Commander. Again, another Commander-focused Planeswalker with its 1000 Year Elixir static ability. If you look at 1000 Year Elixir, it's essentially a combo piece. So the most common combos, like Karametra's Acolyte, Temur Sabertooth. You play your Karametra's Acolyte, it taps to add a ton of mana, then you just bounce it back to your hand with Temur Sabertooth, and then you can replay it, and it has haste because of Tyvar or the 1000 Year Elixir ability to do it again, make infinite mana. Another one is Garth with Displacer Kitten. You Garth to make a Black Lotus, and then you cast a Black Lotus, which will trigger Displacer Kitten to blink the Garth. Garth's going to come down and essentially have pseudo haste thanks to Tyvar, and then you tap it again for a Black Lotus, and then it triggers Displacer Kitten. So you get infinite Black Lotuses, make infinite mana, and then you can, whatever, choose other effects on Garth, like Brain Geyser to draw your deck and use that to win the game. So I think that's where Tyvar fits. I think this card it's pretty fringe. I don't think you're going to play this in most decks, but if you have a 1000 Year Elixir style combo, Tyvar does something that's super unique because we just don't have any other cards that do what 1000 Year Elixir does. So Tyvar, really unique Planeswalker. Calling back to some of the War of the Spark Planeswalkers, where this is one that I think you play primarily for its static ability. It's an enchantment that can die to creature damage, essentially. You play it for the static ability in some sort of combo deck, and then maybe you get a little value out of the other modes as well. It played fairly, not really seeing it outside of maybe that Sultai Golgari graveyard style deck in standard. In older formats, it just gets outclassed, I think. Like, first I was like, oh, Modern, there's a lot of cheap creatures in Modern, can we make this work? But I think it's just bad grist in Modern, so Tyvar, definitely interesting, but I expect this to be more of a fringe combo piece than an evergreen Planeswalker that we see in a lot of decks. Next up, we have our final Planeswalker from the set, a new Jace, a completed Jace, Jace the Perfected Mind. So Jace the Perfected Mind, 4 mana for 5 loyalty, or you can complete it for 3 mana, 2 life, and you'll end up with 3 loyalty, +1 until your next turn. Up to 1 target creature gets -3, -0 until end of turn. -2, target player mills 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards, otherwise you draw a card. -X, target player mills 3 times X cards. So like we were talking about before with Nissa, Jace is another Planeswalker that does its big thing right away if you wanted to. You can play this for 4 mana and just immediately -5 it in mill 15, which isn't that bad. When I first saw Jace, my gut reaction was, oh, this card's not very good. But the more I thought about it, it's not that Jace is bad, it's just that Jace is really narrow. If you're playing a mill deck, Jace is really powerful. Its abilities work really well in a deck that's either trying to aggressively self-mill or mill out the opponent. On the other hand, in any other style of deck, Jace is pretty underpowered and bad, so you really gotta be a mill deck to make this work. If we look at the abilities, the +1 is Dizzy Spell, essentially. It's protection for Jace, protection for your life total, not hard protection. It's not gonna completely shut down a creature, but it is going to help keep Jace's loyalty and your life total high. The -2, it's kind of an upgraded Thought Scour that can eventually be a Visions of Beyond, so you can be milling yourself a bit and drawing a card, or milling your opponent a bit and drawing a card. And then the last mode, the -X, it's pretty efficient. Let's say we complete Jace for 3 mana. It comes in with 3 loyalty. We can negative X for -3 and mill 9 cards, so it's 3 mana, mill 9. That's not quite up to par with the best mill spells. If you look at like modern playable mill spells, you're looking at 2 mana mill 10 in Glissa Unthinkable, or 3 mana mill 14 in Fractured Sanity. Jace doesn't quite get there. Even if you play Jace full price for 4 mana and you spend all of its loyalty on the negative X, you're gonna mill 15 cards for 4 mana, which again, it is efficient, but not quite up to the most efficient mill spells of all time. So the question is going to be, do the other upsides of Jace. You don't have to just play this like a sorcery and mill a bunch of cards. You can do other things with it. You can draw cards, you can plus it to protect your life total, whatever. Do those upsides make up for the fact that it's not quite efficient enough to be up to par with the modern playable mill spells? And I don't really know the answer. So in Standard, I think this is mostly going to be a self-mill card. I was looking through the mill in Standard, and there's really not a lot of options for milling your opponent out. We got Founding the Third Path, a couple of mill half your library cards, but really not enough to build actual mill. So an actual mill deck that's trying to mill the opponent out, that's probably going to have to be something for Explorer and Pioneer and Historic and Modern, rather than in Standard. In Standard, though, this is kind of interesting in Sultai self-mill. Like, if our goal is to just fill our graveyard for Urborg Lurglyphs and Cemetery Tamperings and Consuming Blobs and Old Stick Fingers and Grolnox, Jace is actually pretty appealing. We just play this and mill ourselves a bunch to power up all of our stuff. I could see that actually being worth considering. So I think that's where it fits in Standard. In older formats, it is going to be interesting to see if this makes it in mill decks. I think in Modern, I am right on the fence. I'm leaning towards maybe not, but just barely not, but it is close. I think in like Pioneer mill, in Historic mill, that I'm pretty interested in Jace because you don't have quite as many options as you do in Modern. The other place this is going to be sweet is in self-mill or just dedicated mill commander decks. Stuff like Captain Narthgod or Grolnock or Burvac or Medrotha. If you're really interested in filling your graveyard, or just trying to empty your opponent's graveyard, Jace is a pretty good card. So Jace the Perfected Mind, definitely unique. I was expecting a more generically good Jace, a Jace that you can just throw in any deck, but this Jace is certainly not that. This is a Jace that in mill, it's going to be an all-star. In any other deck, probably going to be left on the sidelines. We also got, oh my god, this card, Mondrak, Glorious Dominus. This card is absolutely absurd. 4 mana, 4/4, legendary Phyrexian Horde. It's a mythic. It says if one or more tokens would be created under your control, create twice that many tokens instead, and then you could pay 1 and double Phyrexian white mana to sacrifice 2 other artifacts and or creatures to put an indestructible counter on it. So essentially it can protect itself if you sacrifice a couple tokens, or protect itself from a good amount of removal anyway. So Mondrak is literally Anointed Procession at the same mana value, except it's on a creature, which has upsides and downsides. The downside is creatures probably die more than enchantments. The upside is this is a legend, so you can play this as your commander. It's an Anointed Procession from the command zone. So let's get the obvious stuff out of the way first, which is this is going to be a bonkers commander card. We kind of saw this happen in Simic already a little while ago with Adrix and Nev, which is essentially the same thing, a doubling season and Anointed Procession that is a legend. And Adrix and Nev immediately became one of the most popular token commanders in the entire format. It just shot up to the top. Everyone was building it. I think we're going to see the same thing with Mondrak. Like right now, if you look at mono white token commanders, the best one or most popular one is Benny Brax, and then it's Elishnorn, which isn't even really a token commander. It just pumps your stuff. So I think this immediately becomes the go-to mono white token commander, which is pretty exciting because white is the best token color. So I think that we're going to be seeing this a lot in Commander. Having an Anointed Procession in your command zone is kind of bonkers. And outside of being your commander, this can go in the 99 of any token commander deck that has white in its color identity. Rotodraba, Kazan, Damar, Jennifer, Reese, Jetmir, Kadria, Thales, you name a token commander that has white in it, and this should be in your 99. The only downside is I'm expecting this card to be super expensive. Even Anointed Procession is like 40 bucks or something now. So I would not be surprised if this is one of the chase cards, one of the expensive cards from the set, because it is incredibly powerful in tokens. So step one, busted in Commander, obviously. However, I am intrigued by this card more in Standard. Everything's good in Commander if you want it to be good, but I think Mondrak can actually be a pretty exciting card in Standard as well. What I'm most hyped for, and I don't know if this is the most competitive way to play it, but I am really hyped to play this with Rotted Rotbrick. So Rotted Rotbrick, when a legend dies, you get a token copy of it, except now you get 2 token copies of it because of Mondrak. So you can do this weird legendary snowball. We played this deck a while ago with Rivaz of the Claw to cast legendary dragons like Ayo and Itsushi and Juji from the graveyard, and then we just loop them and made a ton of tokens with Rotted Rotbrick. Mondrak seems ridiculous in that deck. Like, you're gonna make so many copies of these things, it's gonna be ridiculous. And then Mondrak, if it dies, Rotted Rotbrick can make a token copy of it, and that's gonna make double that, and then it gets out of control absolutely ridiculously fast. Plus it can protect itself if you want to. So I'm hyped about playing with Rotted Rotbrick. You can also go over Joda style Rotted Rotbrick build where you got like Joda and you're cascading into Adalines and Ginnyface and Queen Analias and Mural. There's a ton of legends that also make tokens. Plus you got Rotted Rotbrick that can make your legends into tokens, and you got Joda that's cascading into all these cards. It sounds absolutely bonkers. So really hyped to try those decks. The other way to play this is just play a traditional token deck. Like Mondrak, Rabble Rousing, doubles up the tokens it makes. You make a million tokens. You cast your hideaway cards. Resolute Reinforcements, making 2 tokens. Skitterbeam Battalion is making 4 tokens. Awaken the Woods, I don't even want to think about what happens. You make so many land tokens and they have so much mana. It is going to get wild, and this also works with non-creature tokens, which is probably worth pointing out. Like your Bootlegger stash, you tap a land, now you get 2 treasure tokens, Blood Tithe Harvester, double blood tokens, Tireless Provisioner, every land drop, you're getting double of whatever you want. And finally, there's even combos for this card. This is probably more Commander, like super against the odds, but let's say you got Mondrak as your commander, and you got Spawnsire of Ulamog. Spawnsire has an ability where you can pay 4 mana to make 2 Eldrazi spawn tokens, which sack to make a mana. If you have Mondrak, you spawn to make 4 tokens, so you get back all the mana you spent, so you essentially get infinite creatures entering the battlefield and leaving the battlefield. Same with Mirror Turbine and Clock of Omens. Clock of Omens, you can tap 2 untap artifacts to untap an artifact. Mirror Turbine, it taps to make 2 mirror tokens, so you tap Mirror Turbine, make the 2 mirror sinks to Mondrak, then the mirrors tap to untap Mirror Turbine, and then you just make infinite mirrors. You can also do the same like Spawnsire shenanigans with Summon the School and Phyrexian Altar. Summon the School, 4 mana, makes 2 Merfolk tokens, but then you can tap 4 Merfolk to return it from your graveyard to your hand. So if you have Mondrak, you Summon the School, make 4 tokens, you tap them to get back Summon the School, then you can like sacrifice them to Phyrexian Altar to make mana to recast the Summon the School, infinite creatures coming into play and leaving play. So Mondrak, the card is absolutely ridiculous. It's Anointed Procession on a stick, which is just a super busted effect. So I am hyped for this card in Standard. It's going to be super expensive. It's going to be a Commander All-Star. It's probably the most popular mono white token commander. It's going to be in the 99 of a ton of decks, but I'm really hyped for just the ridiculous things this card can do. This is one of the cards, honestly, I'm most hyped to build around it. Not quite Panorama Elish Norn level, but it is not far behind as far as the Standard decks that I can just not wait to build once Phyrexia finally comes out. Moving from the world of mythics to the world of rares, we have about an infinite number of rares to talk about today, so I'm going to try to keep it short and snappy so this isn't a 3-hour long video, but I get long-winded sometimes, so we'll see how it goes. So first off, we got our rare land cycle for the set, the return of the Allied Fastlands. These lands were originally printed and last printed in Scars of Mirrodin over a decade ago, and they're really good. They see modern play. We got the other half of this cycle years later in Kaladesh, the enemy versions. That cycle sees modern play and heavy Pioneer play. These ones though, the Allied ones, it's been so long since they were printed, they're not actually legal in Pioneer, and that's mostly what I'm hyped about. Like, they're gonna be fine in Standard. They're a good Standard land cycle. Pretty much any rare land cycle is gonna see Standard play just because there's a limited number of options for Standard, but these lands are really going to be a huge deal for Pioneer, giving us the other 5 that we need to complete the full cycle. If you look at the Kaladesh ones, they are maybe the 3rd or 4th most played land cycle in the Pioneer format, and I think we're just immediately going to see these cards show up in a lot of top tier decks in the Pioneer format. We'll see how much they cost. Right now, pre-reprint, they range from like $4 all the way up to $18 for Blackcleave Cliffs. Hopefully the price comes down a bit. I actually think we might have this weird scenario where the most expensive ones, Seacrum Coast and Blackcleave Cliffs, come down in price because of the reprint, but the cheapest ones might actually climb up in price because of the new Pioneer demand for the cards. But either way, it's a really, really solid land cycle. We also got part of our cycle of Twilights, starting with White Sun's Twilight. So this calls back to the Zenith cycle that we had last time we were in New Phyrexia, a colored cycle of sorceries or instants that have some pretty sweet effects. So White Sun's Twilight, 2 white mana plus X. It's a sorcery. You gain X life. You make X 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Mite artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1. Toxic 1, I don't know if we actually talked about this. It means that the creature also deals a poison counter of damage. It's a normal creature, does everything the way it would naturally, except if it deals combat damage to a player, they also get 1 poison counter. Worth mentioning here, doesn't work like Infect. No matter how much damage your Phyrexian Mite with Toxic 1 deals, let's say you use a pump spell to make it massive or whatever, your opponent's still only ever going to get 1 poison counter because of Toxic 1. So anyway, you make the Mite tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block, kind of an annoying drawback, but if X is 5 or more, you destroy all other creatures. So White Sun's Twilight, this is essentially Martial Coup at home, same mana cost, very similar ability essentially. The twist is, I guess there's upsides and downsides. The upside is, you're also going to gain some life, which if you're playing a control deck, one of the obvious homes for a card like this, that's actually nice. Your control against aggro, you cast your Wrath, it's going to be 7 mana to get the Wrath out of it, which is a lot, but then you gain back 5 life or whatever, which helps buff your life total. The downside of White Sun's Twilight is really that the Mite creatures can't block. That is a huge, huge drawback. Still, it's fine, like you can make a bunch of them, you can attack with them, but it is kind of obnoxious. So I think this card has 2 potential homes. One is, seems great in a control deck, where you can just play this as a Wrath that's also going to work like your finisher, and the life gain is relevant. The other place where this can really shine is in a token deck. We were talking about Mondrak and tokens and being hyped about that. Like, imagine Mondrak into this to make a bunch of toxic tokens, hopefully just poison your opponent out of the game. Also works really well with stuff like Jetmir. So we'll have to wait and see. It is a little bit awkward that the if X is 5 or more, destroy all other creatures mode is not a may. So this means if you do cast this for enough mana that triggers, you're going to blow up your Jetmir, you're going to blow up your Mondrak or whatever. I guess you make Mondrak indestructible, but still a little bit annoying that you might accidentally blow up stuff that you don't want to, so you can't just make infinite tokens and keep your board. But still a pretty powerful sweeper slash token card. We also got Black Sun's Twilight, which is essentially Deathwind plus Stir the Grave. Black and X for an instant. Up to 1 target creature gets -X until end of turn. If X is 5 or more, return a creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tap. So it's literally Deathwind mixed with Stir the Grave, except to instant speed, but the creature comes into play tapped. Solid 2-for-1 removal spell. It is kind of expensive. Like, if you want to get the reanimation mode, you're going to need to spend at least 6 mana, but this can lead to some huge blowouts. Imagine playing like Rakdos or Esper, and you cast this for 6 mana. You kill your opponent's Shieldred and reanimate your Shieldred. That is a ridiculous game-winning swing. Like, that is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And the nice thing about how this is worded and the flexibility of it being an X spell is you don't have to wait till you get to 6 mana to cast it. If you really just gotta kill a Blood Tithe Harvester early in the game, or a Mite token that's gonna toxic you out, you can cast it for a lower mana value. So I love the flexibility. The reanimation mode means this is a removal spell that's gonna be good in the late game. It also means it's an okay-ish removal spell for the early game. Also worth mentioning, it says up to 1 target creature gets -X until end of turn. So that means in the late game, if the board is empty or whatever, you can just cast this as a reanimation spell. So Black Sun's Twilight seems good enough to see a lot of play. Yes, it is a lot of mana, but it is a 2-for-1 on a stick. We also got maybe the best Twilight so far, Green Sun's Twilight. Green Sun's Twilight, green and X. Reveal the top X cards plus 1 of your library. Choose a creature card and or a land card from among them. Put those cards in your hand, the rest go in the bottom of your library in a random order. If X is 5 or more, instead put the chosen cards onto the battlefield, or in your hand if you want to, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This card seems pretty bonkers. If you think about what this is, it's kind of like another callback to Green Sun Zenith, but this is essentially a 1-mana cantrip. Like, as long as you're playing a deck with a bunch of creatures and lands, you can cast this for a single green mana, and you should draw a card. You hit a land, you hit a creature, you put it in your hand, or it can be like a green divination. You cast it for 3 mana, you reveal 3 cards, you should hopefully hit a creature and a land. You get to put them both in your hand, and you're drawing 2 cards for 3 mana. But then, as the game goes along, this turns into Summoning Trap, or See the Unwritten, or Turn Timber Symbiosis, where in the late game, you're not just putting those cards in your hand, you're putting them directly on the battlefield, which is absolutely huge. In the late game, you don't want to spend 8 mana on this spell or whatever, and hit your big, powerful Titan of Industry to close out the game, but then have to wait a turn to put it into play. With this, in the late game, you just get to put the card into play, both cards into play right away. So I think that Green Sun's Twilight definitely has a look of a card that can see a lot of play in Standard and maybe in Pioneer. We were talking about with Nissa, how mono green is looking like it could be on the comeback trail just because Nissa is so powerful. Green Sun's Twilight seems like a great source of card advantage for a deck like mono green in Standard. Also a little curious if this can show up in like mono green Devotion or mono green Stompy maybe in a format like Pioneer. Once you get back past Pioneer, things get a little sketchier, and even in Pioneer to some extent, in some decks it's sketchy, just because there's so many options for similar effects. Like Collected Company, Kayla's Reconstruction are just putting multiple things into play for less mana than Green Sun's Twilight. Green Sun Zenith just puts a creature into play earlier in the game. Natural Order can get a huge creature. Eldritch Evolution can tutor out a specific creature. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out. I think worst case, the floor of this card is this is our Green Sun Zenith for Standard. Best case, maybe it has a chance to show up in certain decks in formats like Pioneer as well. So definitely a really sweet card. We also got a new Geth in Geth Thane of Contract. So Geth is a 3-mana 3/4 legendary Phyrexian zombie. Got some nice lobster claws going on now. Other creatures you control get -1/-1, and you can pay 3 and tap it to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains if this creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Activate this only as a sorcery. So Geth, it's basically Cauldron of Eternity on a legendary creature, or maybe a cheaper Chainer Dementia Master, but with the downside that it's giving your creatures -1/-1. It's essentially got the Heartless Summoning drawback built in, which does a couple of things. First off, it just makes your creatures smaller. It also means you can't play X1. So if you want to build a Golgari build of this in a format like Pioneer, you can't play Llanowar Elves, you can't play Elvish Mystic, because Geth's just going to straight up kill him when it comes into play. So this card's really interesting to me. I think the drawback means you really can't just play it in a generic deck. My first thought was, oh, just like jam it in mono black. It's a black card, it's got decent stats, but I don't think you want to make your Graveyard Trespasser a 2/2. So your opponent's Graveyard Trespassers are bigger, or shrink your Tenacious Underdog, or even your Shieldred. The value of getting these cards back from the graveyard is just not enough to make up for shrinking your creatures, I don't think. On the other hand, if you can use this to get back big creatures, Titan of Industries and Cityscape Levelers, then you don't really care. Like a Titan of Industry with -1/-1 is 99% as good as a normal Titan of Industry. Same with Cityscape Leveler. These are cards that are powerful because of their attack triggers or their ETB triggers, plus their stats are so massive, even with -1/-1, they're probably going to be bigger than everything else on the battlefield. So I think that's the direction to go with Geth, is just try to stock your graveyard and reanimate the hugest things possible. As far as Commander is concerned, Chainer in its popularity kind of gives me pause. Like, is Geth better than Chainer? Maybe? I guess the upside is it is only 3 mana to cast, and it doesn't cost any life to reanimate a creature. On the other hand, Chainer is repeatable. You can activate it multiple times in the same turn, and more importantly, Chainer hits your opponent's graveyard. Geth only reanimates from your graveyard, which is a pretty big drawback. So I think that Geth is, I don't know, arguably worse than Chainer, and Chainer really isn't that popular of a card, so I think that Geth would be more of a fun, casual build-around in Commander rather than an all-star. So Geth, Definitely a cool card. Gonna be interesting to see how this shakes out. Whenever you see repeatable reanimation on a pretty reasonable body, you gotta take notice of it because it has potential to be powerful. Whether or not it actually shakes out in 60 card formats or even in 100 card formats for that matter, kinda is up in the air at this point though. Next up, we got an equipment showing off another new mechanic for Mirrodin with an exclamation point, which I gotta say before we talk about this card, the card's sweet, the mechanic's sweet, but the name for Mirrodin, it's so cringy. It reminds me of Clash like on Commander Clash over on the MTG Goldfish Commander YouTube. If you lose before the next episode, you gotta go Clash on, and it's just like so kind of intentionally cringy. For Mirrodin is the WotC version of that. It's even got the exclamation point. My soul dies a little bit every time I read the name. But that aside, the card and mechanic is pretty sweet. So Blade of Shared Souls, 3 mana to cast, 2 to equip. For Mirrodin, exclamation point, Clash on, says whenever this equipment enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 red rebel creature token, then attach this to it. So it's like Living Weapon, but better. And then whenever Blade of Shared Souls becomes attached to a creature, for as long as Blade of Shared Souls remains attached to it, you can have that creature become a copy of another target creature you control. So this is essentially 3 mana, make it 2/2, and then you can make it into a copy of something else you control for as long as you have Blade of Shared Souls. The biggest upside between Mirrodin and Living Weapon is you actually get a real creature. Living Weapon made 0/0 germs that the equipment was attached to, which meant if you move the equipment to another creature, the germ would just die because it was a 0/0. Mirrodin actually makes a legit creature. It makes a 2/2 creature, so if you move your Blade of Shared Souls onto something else, that 2/2 is still gonna be there, which is kind of cute. Like, you could blink this a bunch of times and make a bunch of 2/2s, or even just getting a body with your equipment's pretty powerful. So I think the Mirrodin mechanic is actually very, very strong. As far as Blade of Shared Souls itself, it's essentially mirror image, like a 3 mana clone for your own creatures, except there's a twist here. It doesn't do the thing that mirror image does best, which is copy creatures with ETB triggers. If you look at clones, a lot of times you want to clone and copy your Muldrifter or whatever, something with a powerful ETB trigger, a Titan of Industry. But the way Blade of Shared Souls works, it copies when it becomes equipped. So you're not going to get the ETB trigger of anything that you copy because it's already going to be on the battlefield. It's not entering the battlefield, which means rather than going after things with ETB triggers, this is going to be at its best with things with combat triggers, stuff that triggers when it attacks, stuff that triggers when it deals combat damage. So copying a Cityscape Leveler is obviously absurd. You attack with your copy, it's going to blow something up, or Sphinx of Clear Skies. You hit your opponent, you're going to draw more cards. So keep that in mind. It's a 3 mana clone, but it's a 3 mana clone that doesn't work with ETB triggers. On the other end, you get a bunch of upsides. It's an equipment, so you can Stoneforge Mystic it out. It reduces the cost on affinity. So I really, really like this mechanic. In Blade of Shared Souls, I don't expect this to be like a super powerful card, but boy does it seem like a really, really fun card to play with. We also got Skrelv's Hive, a 2 mana enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and make a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Mite artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. And then it has Corrupted, which says as long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, creatures you control with Toxic have lifelink. So Corrupted's another new mechanic. All it really means is as long as your opponent has at least 3 poison counters, you get some sort of bonus. So Skrelv's Hive, this is a Banner Blossom, I like to call them. It looks like Bitter Blossom, but it's actually not Bitter Blossom. Bitter Blossom is like iconic. It was busted. It was part of Fairies, the best deck in its standard more than a decade ago, 15 years ago at this point. Skrelv's Hive looks similar. It's a 2 mana enchantment that makes a creature every turn. But outside of that comparison, it's worse in basically every way. Bitter Blossom made 1/1 flyers, which is actually pretty powerful. Skrelv's Hive is making 1/1 ground creatures that are actually even worse than that because they can't block. It's making a pretty useless kind of token. I guess it's nice that it has Toxic, so if you're a Toxic deck, it does go up in value, and then eventually you're going to corrupt your opponent, and then your stuff gets lifelink to gain back the life that you lose to Skrelv's Hive. The thing that really makes me skeptical of Skrelv's Hive is Dreadhorde Invasion. Dreadhorde Invasion came out in War of the Spark, and as soon as it came out, everyone was like, oh my god, Bitter Blossom is back, this is gonna be absurd, we got Bitter Blossom again. And then Dreadhorde Invasion went from like pretty hyped to really bad, like completely unplayed. And I think that Skrelv's Hive honestly might actually be even worse than Bitter Blossom, unless you're a dedicated like infect deck, a toxic deck, a poison deck. So I think that Skrelv's Hive is not actually a very good card. If it has a chance, it's either going to be in straight up toxic or maybe in some sort of token deck. Like maybe you use Ginny Fae to turn your mites into cats or dogs that actually can block and actually have more power and toughness. Maybe you can somehow play it with Mondrak where you're doubling up the tokens and then you throw Ginny Fae in. So there are synergies to make it work, but don't think of this as Bitter Blossom. Bitter Blossom, you just could play it and it was your finisher and it was one of the best cards in your deck. I don't think Skrelv's Hive is that. Instead, I think this is kind of a support piece for a token deck or a toxic deck. We also got Skrelv itself. We saw the Hive, now we got the Mite of the day in Skrelv Defector Mite. So 1 mana, 1/1. Legendary Phyrexian Mite. Also, question, why is this legendary? Does this need to be legendary? I don't know. I'm past that at this point, I guess. It has Toxic 1, so if it deals combat damage to a player, they get a poison counter. It can't block, which I guess is a Mite thing. Mites are bad on defense. And then you can pay a Phyrexian white mana, either 2 life or a white mana, and you choose a color. You give another target creature Toxic 1, hexproof from that color until end of turn, and it can't be blocked by creatures of that color this turn. So Skrelv Defector Mite is actually an incredibly powerful card for Standard and Pioneer. If you think about what this card is, this is the Standard / Pioneer version of Mother of Runes or Giver of Runes. We had the original Mother of Runes, only legal in Legacy and Commander, just taps to give any creature, including itself, protection from a color of your choice. Then Giver of Runes can't protect itself, but it can protect your other creature. So this is like Giver of Runes is the modern version of Mother of Runes. Then we got Skrelv, which is powered down. It's legendary, so you can have multiples of them. It costs mana or life to activate it. It can't block, but this is a Standard or Pioneer version of the same effect. If you're playing some sort of aggro deck and you really want to protect your Thalia, you want to protect your Adel, whatever, this card is really, really good. This just fizzles a targeted removal spell. It makes sure you can get in attacks even through blockers. It also, I guess, helps you poison your opponent out of the game, which I don't know if that's actually a big part of why this card is good. But if you are a creature deck, a Coco deck, an aggro deck that needs protection, this is, I think, the best option going in formats like Standard and Pioneer. Like I said before, once you get to Modern or Legacy, you got Giver of Runes, you got Mother of Runes. But in formats where that's not legal, Skrelv is essentially Mite Mom. It is the mom of those formats. It's going to be really, really good in those decks. We also got a new rare Sphere land in the Seedcore. So we don't really know, at least I don't really know, if Sphere means anything, the new land type. We haven't really seen anything for that yet, but the land itself is pretty good. So it comes into play tapped. It adds a colorless mana. It can also add a mana of any color, but you can only use it to spend Phyrexian creature spells. Then it has Corrupted. Target 1/1 creature gets +2/+1 until end of turn. Activate this only if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. So in Standard, if there's some sort of Phyrexian tribal deck where all of your creatures are Phyrexians, this is pretty good. Also seems pretty good for the toxic deck. If you're trying to get in with 1/1 Skrelv tokens or whatever, it's good there. But where this card is really going to shine is in Modern, in Infect in specific. So Modern Infect plays a land called Pendelhaven, which taps to add a green mana, or can tap to give a 1/1 creature +1/+2 until end of turn. The Seedcore is just a hugely upgraded version of Pendelhaven for Infect. If you think about Infect, I know it doesn't say this on the screen because of the errata, these cards were printed before the errata, but Blighted Agent, Plague Stinger, Glistener Elf, literally every creature that Infect decks play outside of Mana Dorks are Phyrexian. So the Seedcore is going to be good mana fixing. It's going to let you cast all of your creatures, help you make the mana you need to cast them, and then it does what Pendelhaven does, but better. And in fact, you're pretty quickly going to get your opponent to 3 poison counters, and then you have a land that just taps to give your Glistener Elf, or Inkmoth Nexus, or Plague Stinger, or Blighted Agent, +2/+1. It's like a pump spell on a land. So I think in Modern, in fact, this just easily replaces Pendelhaven, and you get the upside that it's not legendary. In fact, could really only play 1 copy of Pendelhaven because it didn't want to legend rule itself. So this Seedcore gets around that as well. So Modern Effect's gonna love this. In Standard, I think you really got to be like the Skrelv deck. If there's some sort of white, weenie, toxic deck where you're trying to like chip in for some toxic damage, get your opponent up to, 3-4 poison counters, and then use this to close out the game by pumping your Skrelv's Hive tokens or whatever, I could see that being a possibility. But otherwise, it's going to be hard to make it work, because remember, you can't just throw this in any random deck with a bunch of 1/1s. Like, we've seen Pendelhaven show up in Elves in Modern. You can't really do that with the Seedcore, because how are you going to get those poison counters? If you aren't corrupted, then it doesn't really do much of anything. So you got to be a mixture of 1/1 creatures and also enough poison counters to turn on corrupted, but I think that's a really interesting tension. So the Seedcore, great for Modern Infect in specific, and probably has some standard potential too. We also got the return of Melira in Melira the Living Cure. So 2 mana, Selesnya Legendary Human Scout. It's a 3/3. It says, if you would get 1 or more poison counters, instead you get 1 poison counter, and you can't get additional poison counters this turn, and then you can exile Melira, choose another target creature artifact. When it's put into the graveyard this turn, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So this is kind of a mashup of 3 different cards from Magic's past. First, you get the Poison Hate that you got from original Melira Sylvek Outcast. New Melira, not as good hate. Melira Sylvek Outcast, it did hate on poison, but it actually was more of a combo piece because of creatures not being able to get -1/-1 counters. New Melira, it's going to shut down the poison deck pretty well. If you're only taking 1 poison a turn, that means 10 turns for your opponent to poison you out. So if toxic decks become a thing in Standard, Melira is a pretty good sideboard card there. Then you get a pseudo Safi Eriksdotter ability, the ability to exile Melira to save another thing going to the graveyard. Not as good as Safi, because it has to exile itself, which does matter for a big reason we'll talk about in a minute, but still, that's a pretty sweet ability. Your opponent kills your bomb, you sack Melira, you keep your bomb, Melira sacrificed itself for the cause, and then it's also a 2 mana 3/3, so it's a Watch Wolf, another pretty iconic card. It's got really, really good stats. So as far as the Safi comparison, the biggest problem is Safi is usually a combo piece with like Renegade Rallier and a Sacrifice Outlet, where you're looking to keep looping Safi and Renegade Rallier for infinite Blood Artist triggers or whatever. That's not going to work with Melira, because Melira exiles itself, so you can't do those same loops. So it's like a Safi with no combo potential, but you're getting much better stats. So I could see just playing this in some sort of Selesnya aggro deck in Standard, like a 2 mana 3/3. It's not as insane as it was when Watch Wolf came out, 15 years ago, but it's still pretty decent stats. And then if your opponent goes to kill your Adeline, well, you can sack Melira. If your opponent goes to kill your AO, you can sack your Melira and get your AO back and still get its death trigger. The only thing I will say is we just got Hajar Loyal Bodyguards, which is another 2 mana 3/3 that's currently in Standard and also Legendary and also has upside. And we haven't really seen Hajar take off yet, so I don't know if that's a vote against Melira, but I think that Melira, it's a good card. It's got good stats. It's got a ton of text. It's a 2023 card, so there's got to be someone somewhere who can make use of this. Probably some sort of green-white collected company aggro style deck. We also got one of my favorite cards from the set, maybe the worst card from the set, but one of my favorites, Graaz Unstoppable Juggernaut. So 8 mana 7/5 legendary artifact creature Juggernaut says Juggernauts you control attack each combat if able. Juggernauts you control can't be blocked by walls, and other creatures you control have base power and toughness of 5/3 and are Juggernauts in addition to their other types. So Graaz, this literally just turns everything that you have into a Juggernaut, an iconic artifact creature going all the way back to Alpha. This is the Juggernaut Tribal Commander. This was not something I had on my Phyrexia checklist. I was not expecting this, but it does go to show, if you love some horrible tribe that is under-supported, give it a year or two and Wizards will print a commander for you. If Wizards is printing Juggernaut Tribal Commanders, it will certainly print a commander for whatever horrible Beeble or tribal deck you're hoping to get. As far as what you do with this card, I mean, it's mostly a meme. You build Juggernaut Tribal Commander and it's really funny and it's just hilarious. I think that's the main goal. If it has any chance of working in Standard, it's probably a payoff for a token deck where you like White Sun's Twilight, make a ton of Mite tokens, the next turn Graaz, turn them all into 5/3s and just try to smash your opponent to death. Or Awake in the Woods, make a ton of Dryad Arbor tokens, and then Graaz and smash your opponent to death. Is this better than Cityscape Leveler? Is it better than Titan of Industry? I would be absolutely shocked shocked. But, I mean, that's a thing you could do on a Budget Magic or Against the Odds episode, and we probably will end up doing that because I really love this card. So, mostly just a really janky, funny commander, but could have some really jank standard potential as well. Next up, we get a toxic little 1-drop in Venerated Rotpriest, a 1-mana 1/2 Phyrexian Druid. It has toxic 1, so if it gets in combat damage, your opponent gets a poison counter, and it says whenever a creature you control becomes a target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. So Venerated Rotpriest, on level 1, it's kind of just protection for a toxic deck, similar to Shaper's Sanctuary. If your opponent targets your stuff, they're going to get a poison counter. That's kind of nice. If your goal is to poison your opponent out, that's a pretty huge upside. Don't know if it's enough upside to let it show up in Modern, in fact, I guess maybe, but in a standard toxic deck, this seems like a pretty chase 1-drop. The most interesting aspect of this card to me, though, is it works whenever any spell targets your Venerated Rotpriest. So what this means is you can target it with a Giant Growth or a Become Immense, or maybe some can-tripping targeting spell that you can try to storm off with and give your opponent poison counters, which seems pretty neat. Like, yes, Toxic doesn't really interact with pump spells the way that Infect does, but still, the fact that this triggers on your own spells, if you cast a spell to save one of your creatures or whatever, a protection spell, a pump spell, your opponent gets a poison counter, that's actually kind of hilarious. Maybe there's a way this could show up in Modern. I think it's kind of a stretch. Modern's just so much about hitting you with 1 or 2 big attacks with an Infect creature to close out the game with poison counters. Venerated Rotpriest can't do that. On the other hand, it is pretty hilarious that when you target your Glistener Elf with a pump spell, your opponent gets a bonus counter because of Venerated Rotpriest. So we'll have to wait and see. I think worst case, a nice little toxic 1-drop for standard. Best case, maybe it sees a little bit of Modern play. We also got an absurdly over-the-curve 3-drop in Bloated Contaminator. So Bloated Contaminator, it's a green card. Of course, it's over the curve, so it's green. 3 mana, 4/4 Phyrexian Beast. It has Trample, it has Toxic 1, and it has, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, Proliferate. This card is ridiculous. So a 3 mana 4/4, that's already absurd. That's already Old Growth Troll. Actually, I went and looked back through the history of Magic. The only other 3 mana 4/4 Trampler I could find without a big drawback was Old Growth Troll. Old Growth Troll, currently a Pioneer staple, was a very good card in Standard. Bloated Contaminator, yeah, it doesn't quite do everything Old Growth Troll does, coming back after it dies as an enchantment that ramps and makes another thing, but it has the same stats and it has a much less restrictive mana cost. And then you also get a huge upside of having essentially a Thrumming Bird. When you hit your opponent with this, you get to proliferate. So you get to add a counter to whatever you want to add a counter to. More importantly, this also means that that Toxic 1 is kind of toxic too, because you give your opponent the poison counter and then you can proliferate it to get an additional counter. To me, this card just seems absolutely wonky, like so strong. So I think this is just good enough to play in any generic green beatdown deck. I mean, its stats and mana costs are just good enough to make that work, but it's going to be at its best in a deck that can also take advantage of the proliferate, which I think in Standard is maybe like a Gruul Modify deck. You got Ascendant Pack Leader getting counters, you got Gallic Reader getting counters, you have payoffs for stuff having counters, the Modify stuff like Kedama the Westry, Thundering Raju, Halana Lane to condemn counters on thing, and then you got Bloated Contaminator that just comes down, is an above the curve threat that tramples in for damage, gives you a backup win con of maybe poisoning your opponent, and then it's proliferating the counters to grow your team. If you have a counter on all your team, when this hits your opponent, it's adding an extra counter to everything, which is off the charts. I think this could also maybe show up in formats like Pioneer or maybe even Modern. So the downside is the most obvious home is like Mono Green Devotion, and the fact that Bloated Contaminator only has 1 green mana symbol, actually kind of a big drawback there. However, this really synergizes outside of Nykthos with everything that deck wants to do. Like your Llanowar Elves, your Elvish Mystic lets you play Bloated Contaminator on turn 2, which is really strong. And then you have a bunch of Planeswalkers, Kioras and Karns and Nissas. Bloated Contaminator is going to be adding counters to those, rushing you to your ultimate, protecting them from your opponent's attacks. So I think that Bloated Contaminator at least has potential back to Pioneer. And then if you're trying to play some sort of proliferate deck in a format like Commander, it gets even better. So this card, I don't even know what to say. It's just like above the curve. It is above the curve, even by 2023 standards. It's got a ton of attacks, it's got good stats, it's got a cheap mana cost. I would be very surprised if this card wasn't at least very good in standard, and I think it's got a shot all the way back to Commander, or at least back to Pioneer. Speaking of above the curve green 3-drops, we also got the return of Glissa in Glissa Sunslayer, and I love this card. So Glissa, 3 mana, Golgari Phyrexian Zombie Elf. It's a 3/3 with first strike and death touch, so it's essentially unbeatable in combat. And it says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, choose one. You draw a card and lose a life. Amazing. Destroy an enchantment, also really good in current standard, or remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. So Glissa Sunslayer, this is our third Glissa. We had Sunseeker, that was the good version of Glissa, and then Glissa became a traitor, and now we got the full-on Phyrexian Glissa Sunslayer. But this probably is the most powerful of the Glissas we've seen so far. So first off, first strike and death touch is an incredibly powerful combination of abilities. What it means is you get to deal damage to your opponent's creatures first in combat, and because of death touch, it only takes 1 damage to kill it, which means if your opponent swings at you with a Titan of Industry or a Shieldred or a Elesh Dorn Mother of Machines, Glissa just takes them down, and Glissa doesn't even take any damage. Like, it doesn't die in that exchange, so it's really good at attacking, it's really good at blocking, and being really good at attacking and your opponent not wanting to block it is a great way to turn on Glissa's other abilities. You get this like Ophidian, which is even better because you're actually dealing damage and hitting for 3 each turn. If you choose to draw a card and lose a life mode, you also can blow up an enchantment, which might not sound like much, but in our current standard where Fable, the Mirror Breaker, and Wedding Announcement are some of the best cards in the format, and enchantment style decks are pretty popular, it's actually a huge upgrade. And the same is true in Commander, where there's a lot of enchantments floating around, so being able to hit and blow that up is really, really strong. Also worth mentioning that it doesn't say destroy target enchantment that defending player controls or anything like that. So in Commander, you can do some politicking and be like, hey Tomer, Richard's got this posted enchantment, can I hit you for 3 and I'll blow up Richard's Mirari Wake or whatever. Like, that's something that you can do with Glissa. And then the last mode, remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. This one, we're gonna have to wait and see. We know that oil counters are a big theme of the set, and there's stuff that wants counters added to them. We haven't really seen much of that yet from Phyrexia, so I'm not really exactly sure what that's gonna do. I guess you can remove counters from a saga. It's kind of cute, going back to Fable, the Mirror Breaker, like go back to the first lore counter to reuse its abilities and do that with other sagas. That's kind of a neat way to keep your sagas going longer. The first thing I thought of though was there's another new card called Archfiend of the Dross, which is the 4 mana 6/6 flying Phyrexian demon that enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it, and at the beginning of your upkeep you gotta remove an oil counter from it, but then if it has no oil counters you lose the game, and then when a creature an opponent controls dies, its controller loses 2 life. Glissa's kind of hilarious against that. Like, I guess your opponent can chump block with the Archfiend, but Glissa removing the counters from Archfiend and just making your opponent lose the game is absolutely kind of hilarious. So I think that Glissa, the only question is, how does it compete with the rest of the really strong black 3-drops we got Gix, which also is a 3-drop that draws a ton of cards. We got Graveyard Trespasser, which is just proven to be a really good card back to Pioneer. Can Glissa find its way to playability through this tough competition? I think the answer is yes in some numbers. Like, you gotta be Golgari, but if you have the right colors of mana, I think that Glissa is on par with Gix and on par with Graveyard Trespasser, because it just can snowball snow hard, and its ability to destroy enchantments and even remove counters offers a lot of upside outside of just card advantage. In older formats, downside isn't like Modern, it does die to Lightning Bolt, so I don't think it's gonna make it there. Pioneer though, I could see an argument for this. Pioneer is built around Elvish Mystics and 1 mana dorks. Being able to get Glissa down on turn 2 and then just start attacking and snowballing the card advantage seems like a great way to pick up some free wins. Plus it's an elf, and we've seen Golgari elves being a thing that's on the fringe of those formats. It's cheap enough to get hit by Collected Company, so I think worst case a elf deck would take advantage of this. Best case, maybe just some generic mid-range deck, like some old school Jund style action. It seems like this just offers enough value to make it worth it. So Glissa, one of my favorite cards from the set. I think this is just a very solid creature. We also got Conduit of Worlds, a new artifact, 4 mana artifact, lets you play land cards from your graveyard, and then you can choose target non-land permanent card in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. only activate this as a sorcery. So essentially, this is Crucible of Worlds for +1 mana, and you need to be in green. But Crucible of Worlds lets you play lands from your graveyard, and then you get a little bit of Underworld Breach thrown in. No combo potential here. You're not going to cast your entire graveyard and do those shenanigans, but the ability to recast a non-land card from your graveyard, that's a nice little upside. However, the cost is pretty high. It's worth keeping in mind. If you do choose to cast the non-land permanent from your graveyard, that is the only thing you can cast that turn. You can't cast spells before it, you can't cast spells after it. So what I'm envisioning is you play this as a Crucible of Worlds because you're a deck that wants to be getting lands back from the graveyard, and then in the late game, you don't got anything going on. You're like, all right, I'll just cast something from the graveyard this turn. It's better than doing nothing. Or you're wanting to cast a very specific thing repeatedly. Maybe one of the most interesting aspects of this is the permanent that you cast with Conduit of Worlds. You can cast it again if it goes back to the graveyard. There's no like, once it leaves the battlefield, exile it or anything like that. So there's some shenanigans there as well. In Standard, we got decks that care about getting lands in the graveyard. Titania, Solo Windgrace, Conduit seems like a nice addition there. Like, it's working with your get lands in the graveyard theme and your ramp theme. Plus, then if your Titania dies, so just cast it from your graveyard with Conduit, or your Solo Windgrace dies, cast it from the graveyard with Conduit. Or if you mill over a Titan of Industry that's going to close out the game, well, you know what? I'll just cast it from my graveyard with Conduit. So I think in those self-mill style decks, they have land shenanigans. Conduit seems like a really powerful effect. If you can get up to 5 mana or turn 5, you can play this and immediately make a land drop from the graveyard, which helps get around the drawback of it getting killed. And then in the late game, the ability to cast other stuff is very strong as well. Also kind of hyped to try maybe the Return of Value Town with this card. We've seen in the past some really sweet modern decks where you're trying to like make extra land drops with Azusa, but you're also making them from the graveyard with something like Ramanamp Excavator, and then you're using those land drops to like Ghost Quarter your opponent or Field of Ruin your opponent a bunch of times until you get through all their basics and eventually start strip mining them. Conduit of Worlds seems great for that playstyle. It's a Ramanamp Excavator that isn't gonna die to creature removal, and then if your opponent kills your Azusa, well, Conduit can let you play it from your graveyard or whatever other big important piece that you have. The other really cute synergy with this that I mentioned before a little bit is you can recast the same non-land permanent. A lot of times when cards let you cast something from your graveyard, you end up exiling them. You have flash a spell back and you exile it, or you reanimate something, but it gets a counter, so when it dies, it goes to exile rather than back to your graveyard. Conduit of Worlds doesn't have that restriction, which means you can cast the same permanent every single turn from your graveyard if you want to, which means it works really well with Evoke. Like Fury, Solitude, Grief, Muldrifter, Shriekmaw. These are some really strong cards in Modern, and in Commander for that matter, that tend to put themselves in your graveyard. You can evoke them, they do their thing, then they end up in the graveyard, and you can evoke from your graveyard. So Conduit of Worlds, once you get things going, you could be evoking a Fury or a Solitude or a Grief or a Muldrifter or a Shriekmaw and destroying your opponent's board and stripping their hand and drawing tons of cards every single turn again and again from your graveyard. Sure, it's your only spell for the turn, so that's still a big drawback, but some decks are not going to beat a Fury every turn. You just wrath your board, wrath your board, wrath your board, eventually play a finisher and win the game, or Solitude away your thing, Solitude away your thing, Solitude away your thing, play a finisher and win the game. I also think this is a great Commander card. In Commander, if you're playing Crucible of Worlds and you're in green, I think I'd just play Conduit of Worlds instead. Yes, it is 1 more mana, but the upside of getting to cast that non-land permanent from your graveyard, that's enough to make up for it. Honestly, if you're a Titania deck or a Gitrog deck or Omnath deck, a deck that wants Crucible of Worlds, you probably just play both. You play Conduit of Worlds and Crucible of Worlds, but I actually think in Commander in specific, where being as efficient as possible isn't as important as it is in 60 card formats, this is probably just better Crucible of Worlds, discounting color identity issues. So Conduit of Worlds, the card's really, really sweet. It's super strong. I think you can see Standard play, definitely going to see Commander play, and I'd like to rebuild something like Modern Value Town and see if this can be the card that makes it work again. We also got a pretty sweet reprint in Phyrexian Arena. You probably know what it does. Just 3-mana enchantment, beginning your upkeep, you draw a card and lose a life. Card's like $10-ish, so value-wise, I think it's a good reprint for Commander. It's a card that I still like a lot in Commander. I jam this in pretty much all of my black decks just as a card advantage effect. $10 isn't ridiculously expensive, but hopefully this reprint drops it down even further, makes it a nice budget option for Commander. Outside of Commander, I don't know if this card's good enough for Standard for 2 reasons. Number one, we have a lot of 3-drops that already generate card advantage or just really above the curve like Graveyard Trespasser, but do you need a Phyrexian Arena if you could play Gix, or if you could play Glissa Sunslayer, a creature with good stats that also is going to draw you a card and maybe even more cards? The other reason is Standard is pretty prepared for enchantments. Because of Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Eddie announced it, players are packing their enchantment hate, so I don't know how practical it is for Phyrexian Arena to stick on the battlefield for a bunch of turns. That said, I am interested in trying this in Pioneer and also in Explorer in Mono Black Devotion. That's one place where I really like it. It's 2 black pips. It keeps you churning through your deck each turn. You're gaining back to life with Grey Merchant anyway. It's a card that we've played in the past in like modern Mono Black Devotion, and now that it'll be legal in Pioneer and Explorer for the first time. So Standard, I don't know if it'll make it. Pioneer seems pretty sweet, and hopefully it makes it a little cheaper for Commander. We also got Archfiend of the Dross, which we mentioned briefly. That's the big 4-mana 6/6 flyer that comes into play with 4 oil counters, but you gotta remove them, and when you remove the last one, you lose the game. This is a card that is kind of modeled after something like Abyssal Persecutor, like an old school Magic Demon, where it's powerful, it's above the curve, but when things go wrong, they go really wrong. Like straight up, you lose the game wrong. So it's high risk, high reward Magic. One of the things that concerns me about it is actually Glissa. We talked about this before. The possibility of Glissa removing the counters and making you lose the game. As I said, you should be able to chump block the Glissa with Archfiend, but that's still not very exciting. The other concern about this thing Standard play is I just don't know if it's good enough anymore. It seems ridiculous to say this, that a 6/6 flyer for 4 is just not actually good enough to see play, but it's competing with Shieldred, probably the best card in Standard. It's competing with Sorin, and then we got cards like Henrika Dominithi and Bloodvial Purveyor, which are pretty big, powerful, flying cards that just haven't been good enough to actually show up in Standard. So if those cards aren't good enough, I don't know if Archfiend of the Dross is either. However, there is one thing I can't wait to do with the card. One of the decks I want to build first, and I'm sure this deck will lose us an infinite number of games, but it'll be so sweet as we lose, is Archfiend of Dross Fateful Handoff combo. Fateful Handoff, you give your opponent an artifact or a creature you control, and you also get to draw cards equal to its mana value. So the idea is you play Archfiend of Dross, you let the counters tick down, or maybe remove some counters with Glissa to speed up the process, and then you Fateful Handoff. You draw 4 cards, you give your opponent the Archfiend, and you're like, all right, can you kill this before you remove the last oil counter? If not, you're going to lose the game rather than me. So I've been looking for a good card to actually make a Fateful Handoff deck, and we just haven't had any in Standard. The best is like Solkanar, but Solkanar actually is like pretty janky with Fateful Handoff. So I'm really hyped to try that. Maybe we can build an Archfiend of Dross Fateful Handoff deck. So Archfiend, I don't know. I think the days of Desecration Demon being a Standard staple are over, and I think the, 4-mana 6/6 flyer with a drawback, I don't know if that's good enough anymore. So I'm skeptical this is going to replace Shieldred and be a legit top tier Standard playable card, but in Fateful Handoff, way better than Shieldred there. We also got, this card, so good, Vindictive Flamestoker. 1 mana in red, Phyrexian Wizard. It's a 1/2. Says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it, and then you can pay 7 mana, 6 in a red, sacrifice it, discard your hand, and then draw 4 cards. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each oil counter on Vindictive Flamestoker. This card to me seems absolutely ridiculous. It's a 1 mana 1/2, so its stats are fine, not exciting, but it's fine. And then whenever you sling a spell, it's getting a counter, and then eventually you're sacrificing this for maybe 1 mana, maybe slightly more than that, and essentially refueling your hand. It reminds me of Bedlam Reveler mixed a little bit with Bomet Courier or Friend Bonded Courier, where they are cards that reward you for playing spells, reward you for getting empty-handed by refilling your hand. Vindictive Flamestoker kind of does the same thing, where if you can play this on turn 1, and you're playing a deck that just has spells, considers, and play with fires, by the time you run out of cards, you should be able to sack this for 1 or 2, or maybe at worst 3 mana, and draw 4 cards. That's more cards than Bedlam Reveler. That is a huge refuel. That's a huge burst of card advantage to close out the game. So I'm really excited to try this in Standard in like a Belmore Monastery Swiftspear deck. I think it'll be great in just like a burn deck. If you want to be mono red, play this, cast your play with fires, clash your burn spells, and eventually use Vindictive Flamestoker to refuel. Also worth mentioning that even if you got to pay 4 mana or something, 5 mana, in mono red, once you run out of cards and you're top decking, you draw that land and you're like, oh no, not another land. I don't have anything to do this turn. Even if you're spending all of your mana to activate Flamestoker to refill your hand, it is going to be worth it and it is going to feel great. So burn in standard, mono red in standard, Belmore in standard. Another place I'm hyped about this is we got a wizard burn deck coming up in a couple of days for Budget Magic, next week for Budget Magic, and it's a Pioneer deck, and it's using wizards to power up Wizard's Lightning, get a Lightning Bolt in the Pioneer format, and we're playing Get 2 Lava Runner in that deck. Lava Runner, it's really not great. It's okay, I guess, but I think I would snap replace it with Vindictive Flamestoker. Play it, yeah, it doesn't have quite as much power, but it still is a wizard, so it's turning on my Wizard's Lightning, it's working with any tribal synergies, and then I cast enough burn spells that I should be able to use this to refuel. And one thing I found with the Wizard Burn deck is it is a deck that's really reliant on drawing the right amount of lands. If you draw 8 lands, you're gonna lose. You're not gonna have enough action. If you get stuck on 1 land, you're probably gonna lose. Vindictive Flamestoker just seems like the perfect way to smooth that out, where if you are flooding out and drawing too many lands, this is a way to get through that pocket of lands, find the rest of the action you need to close out the game. In Modern, honestly, this would be a card that I would have been excited about like 4 years ago. In pre-Modern Horizons 2 Modern, we'd be talking about, wow, can this work in Modern? Can we make a wizard deck in Modern? Where does this fit in Modern? However, in Modern Horizons 2 Modern, it's just not Ragavan. It's not Dragon Rage Channeler. Like, yeah, it's a good card, but it's not greatest of all time busted card. And to actually find a home in Modern these days, you gotta be greatest of all time busted cards. Like, there just sadly isn't really a home for cards like this, I don't think, anymore in Modern. We've moved past that thanks to Modern Horizons. So in that aspect, it makes me a little bit sad because, like I said, a few years ago, this would be a card I would be hyped about for trying to build around in Modern. But now it just kind of looks pretty bad compared to Modern Horizons 2 cards. So Vindictive Flamestoker, really powerful spell slinging effect with some upside to being a wizard. Speaking of really powerful spell slinger cards, we also got Mercurial Spelldancer. So 2 mana, 2/1. It's a blue card. It's a Phyrexian rogue. It can't be blocked. When you cast a non-creature spell, it gets an oil counter. And then when it deals combat damage to a player, you can remove 2 oil counters from it. If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You can choose new targets for the copy. This card also seems absurd to me. So all it takes is 2 spells, and you get enough counters that you can remove them and you get to copy the next spell that you cast. Plus, yes, I know you got to get in combat damage with it, but it can't be blocked, so that doesn't really matter. It's unblockable. It's always going to be able to get in combat damage if it's on the battlefield. So once again, in Standard, this seems like another great piece to that deck we were talking about. Vindictive Flamestoker, Monastery Swiftspear, Belmore, Third Pass Iconoclast, where you sling some spells, you get some counters, you hit your opponent with Spelldancer, and then you don't really need to copy anything absurd to make this worth it. Like, it's free. You're not spending any mana. You're not doing anything. You're just like doing what your deck wants to do anyway. You're getting to copy a spell for free. So even if you're just copying a Play with Fire, sure, double the damage, a Consider, double the card draw, a Rending Flame, and you probably can do this every turn that this sticks on the battlefield. In the decks that would want this, the spell-slinging, Consider, Young Pyromancer style decks, it's not that hard to cast 2 non-creature spells pretty much every turn. Plus, that's not even including, like, Proliferate, which would add even more counters. So it seems very possible that this is just going to be copy a spell every turn this stays on the battlefield, which is kind of ridiculous. As far as seeing play outside of Standard, there's a lot of competition. I think, yes, it could show up in a Young Pyromancer Spellslinger style deck for the same thing we were just talking about in Standard, but maybe a sneakier home is Rogue Tribal. Rogues is another deck that has a lot of spells. You're casting Thought Seizes and Into the Stories and so forth, so it has enough spells that you'd want to copy to make it worth it. And then this is a tribe member. It's working with Soaring Thought Thief. It's working with Thieves Guild Enforcer. It's unblockable, so it's chipping in for damage. So that kind of rogue temple play style, Mercurial Spelldancer seems perfect for that as well. So Mercurial Spelldancer, I think this card's really strong. Yes, it is a creature. It needs to sit on the battlefield for at least 1, probably 2 turns to really be good. But if it does, it is a ridiculously strong effect that is going to offer a ton of free value and get in a bunch of combat damage. So I think this might be one of the best 60 card format cards in the entire set. Finally today, we got a bunch more rares. There's so many cards. These are the rares that I'm least, I don't want to say hype for, because there's some things I really like about some of these cards, but the cards that I think are least relevant from today's spoilers. So New Azari, I think it's just too expensive to matter. Urabraska's Forge, too slow to matter. Norn's Wellspring, few years ago would be hype because it's white card draw, but we've gotten so much white card draw that's not super exciting anymore. The Monumental Facade, a way to add oil counters to things. Maybe that's the card that could help Urabraska's Forge work. Urabraska's Forge, if we get enough proliferate and ways to add counters, maybe it can get somewhere. So something like Monumental Facade could be a way to go there. Ovika is like the world's biggest young pyromancer. The problem is Spellslinger decks don't really want a 7-drop, I don't think. Maybe in Commander's Spellslinger could be kind of a fun casual card where you make a ton of tokens, which would be kind of funny, but I don't think it's going to make it in Standard. Venser makes me a little bit sad because Venser is my favorite Planeswalker, and now it's back, finally. I've been asking for Venser's return for like a decade, and now it's back, but it's a pretty not great 2-drop, and it's, I don't know, a corpse puppet apparently, but Venser, it's really good if you can proliferate a lot. So we're in wait-and-see mode. If there's a proliferate deck, I think Venser will be a key 2-drop, but its abilities, the ones that really make it powerful, care about proliferating so much that if you're not a proliferate deck, Venser doesn't really do a ton. And then Encroaching Mycosynth makes me really happy and really sad. On one hand, it's a really cool jank card. It turns all your non-lands into artifacts, and all of your spells into artifacts, and all of your non-lands that you own that aren't on the battlefield into artifacts. So I'm sure there's some sweet shenanigans, and I am super hyped to do some theory crafting and brew a sweet against the odds deck with this card. On the other hand, it does make me wish for real Mycosynth Lattice. It still hurts that Karn dodged the banning, and Mycosynth Lattice, which is so much better because it hits your opponent's stuff, so you can like Vandal Blast away your opponent's lands and whatnot. But it's so sad that Karn managed to survive, and it was Lattice that got banned. So happy that we got a very fixed, watered down version of Lattice that we can do some brewing with now, but a little sad that we don't have the original. We also got just a bunch of lower rarity stuff. Some of it's pretty good. Experimental Augury, Anticipate that also proliferate, kind of insane for a common. That card I think we'll see a ton of play, especially in proliferate decks. Shieldred's Edict gets around the big Edict problem by making your opponent sacrifice non-tokens or planeswalkers. Ossification, actually a pretty good removal spell if your deck has a lot of basics. 2 mana, exile a creature or planeswalker until it leaves the battlefield. But really, there's just so many cards released today that we can't do all of these cards justice. So look them up over at mtgpreviews.com. Check them out, see all the other stuff, and keep up on all the latest spoilers coming out through the next few days. And anyway, that brings us to the end of what I believe is our longest spoiler video of all time. The biggest spoiler video ever, and we've been doing this for quite a while. So that brings us to the end of our spoilers for today. Let me know what you think. So many cards today. What are you most hyped for? What are you thinking of this set overall? What are you building? What are you brewing? What are you hoping for tomorrow? We still got a whole week, a week plus of spoilers to go. What are you hoping to see the rest of spoiler season? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will be back tomorrow with hopefully a slightly more reasonably linked spoiler video. Until then, have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.